The beautiful, colourful parts of autumn were over in England, and had been for some weeks now, but it was nowhere more obvious than the forests surrounding the Malfoy Manor. I had no trouble imagining that, at the height of the season, the environs would be stunning. The trees along the hillside all manner of red and orange and gold, the river running through the nearby valley glittering in the October sun. But it wasn't October anymore. It was well into November, and what leaves remained on the now skeletal trees were limp and brown, the river frosted over at the edges, and the manor itself a looming black shadow atop its hill. "Evil deaths," Trelawney whispered beside me, her long-fingered hands rubbing together as though she could not keep them still. "Evil deaths, evil deaths." I wanted to comfort her, but wasn't quite sure how to do it. In any case, I couldn't fault her for her agitation. I was agitated too. My eyes turned nervously back to the manor. Its front doors were open in a way that brought to mind the mouth of some huge beast, set to dive forward and devour its prey whole. Two of my investigators huddled together just outside, talking quietly and shooting anxious glances into the darkness every few seconds, as if it was a predator they couldn't risk looking away from. A third passed them on her way out, breathing hard. "Are you ready?" I asked Trelawney, some part of me hoping she'd say no, and I'd buy myself a few more precious moments of not having to walk into the beast's waiting maw. "Never," she answered, voice hoarse. "Never, never. I'm never ready to reach through the veil, least of all here." I patted her shoulder since I did not know what to say. The little winking rhinestones on her shawl clinked against one another at the movement. Then, with a steadying breath that did not steady me at all, I went inside. The first word that occurred to me as I entered was heavy. The massive walls, the shadows, even the air itself felt as though they had a physical weight on my body. The vaulted ceiling of the two-story entryway towered far overhead, ancient grey stone carved with intricate bas-relief scrollwork between its ribs. A single huge chandelier made of cast iron was lit with what must have been 100 candles, and yet still did nothing to cut through the thick, oppressive darkness. I could feel the weight of the building like water in my lungs, like lead in my veins. Heavy, heavy, heavy. Harry. Hello. Coming down the huge curving stone staircase, a crown of golden hair on black mourning garb, was Narcissa, thin hands wringing together near her breastbone. "Narcissa," I answered, and took her outstretched hand as soon as she was at the bottom of the steps, less a shake and more a reassuring grip. "It's good to see you again. I wish the circumstances were better." "I'm just grateful you're here at all, though I feel I must apologize for the—" Her eyes trailed upward and mine followed. A gust of strong wind howled as it broke against the walls of the Malfoy Manor, rattling thin windows and shrieking against shingles. "It wasn't always like this, if you can believe it," Narcissa continued, after the sound of it died down. "There was a time when this place was renowned for its beauty. I recall arriving here for the first time as the Lady Malfoy, newly married, and being overwhelmed by its majesty. But I suppose time has taken its toll. I don't know why Draco insisted on staying here like he did." "He lived here alone?" I asked, surprised without quite knowing why. "He did. I lost count of how many times I offered to let him stay with me in France, but he always refused. 'The Malfoy Manor needs a Malfoy,' he'd say. I know ancestral estates like these can be temperamental, but—" Her eyes once again moved across the heavy shadows and oppressive stillness of the entryway, nose wrinkled as if in distaste. I could hear the second half of her sentence without her having to say it. But was it worth it? "Hello, Narcissa," came Trelawney's tremulous voice from behind me, which drew both our attention. "Sybil, hello, it's been so long." She descended the final step, and I turned in time to see her kiss either of Trelawney's cheeks in a familiar, intimate gesture. "I see you're already acquainted," I said. "Same year, same house, good friends," Narcissa answered fondly. "We even fought over the same boys together." "We were younger then," Trelawney answered. She was trying very hard to sound casual and warm, but her anxious eyes and nervous tics betrayed her. Her gaze kept darting to every dark corner, and she twitched at every sound. "Harry tells me that you're here in your capacity as a medium, that you're going to perform a séance." Yes. "I've cleared out the parlour for you. It's at the very centre of the house, which, if I recall our days in divination class together right, is the ideal place for it." "Yes." Narcissa's smile strained. "I'll show you where it is. Harry, I'm sure you'll want to see his room. It's upstairs to the right. Your inspectors have already marked it." I nodded, and Narcissa put one arm around Trelawney's shoulder, walking her gingerly through an archway just to the left of the front door. Their footsteps faded into silence, and I was alone. Without the conversation to distract, the heaviness of the manor settled back on my shoulders. Another wind screamed around the building. I sucked down a hard breath and forced my feet to move to carry me upstairs. The door I was looking for was only halfway down the long hallway, wide open and covered with a thin lattice of spellwork to keep out anyone with malicious intent. An inspector walked out and past me just as I walked in. I wasn't sure what I'd been expecting the bedroom of an adult Draco Malfoy to look like, but what greeted me was still somehow surprising. It was cluttered before it was anything else, overrun with books and parchment on every conceivable surface. The sizable bookcase was stuffed full, overflowing onto the nearby chest of drawers and heaped in untidy stacks on the floor and armchair. A desk by the curtained window was a battlefield of half-filled papers, broken quills, and spilled ink bottles. Letters, only some of them open, had been heaped on a small vanity. But of course these things all distracted from the centerpiece of the room, massive and soaked in blood, the bed. My heart began thudding quickly in my ears. I moved toward it on unsteady legs. Truly, there was so much blood, a huge red stain on pale sheets, as if someone had bled there for hours, and the duvet and pillows were all pushed to the edges as though that bloodless corpse had then climbed out of the bed and left with nary a trace. The blood, impossibly, was still wet. I saw my own hand reaching down toward it before my conscious mind caught up and forced it back to my side. I made myself turn away, toward the desk and its piles of parchments. I picked up the first one my eyes found and lifted it to the light of the nearby wall sconce to read. Truly completely alone and, in this way, be set free. After all, she reasoned, was the judgment of others not the most insidious prison of all? One need not fear the scorn of society, she insisted, if she hid from it wholesale. But he did not look persuaded. In fact, when she stopped talking long enough to regard him properly, his face had contorted with horror, dark eyes wide, breathing shallow. She advanced toward him in concern. He retreated as though from a shade. "No," he whispered, "stay away." At this moment precisely, she caught a flash of red in the mirror on the wall beside her. Blood, so much blood, was fountaining out of her mouth and down the front of her white dress. How had she not noticed? Where had it come from? Had she tried so hard to force the words out that the effort tore her throat, and all that had come out was blood? She looked back at Edgar, who had retreated back against the wall, brows shiny with sweat, pupils blown and trembling all over. Of all the ways he had ever looked at her, this was the worst. She tried to say his name. All that came out was more blood, down her throat and onto the floor, slick and hot under her bare feet. He screamed, and she screamed with him. Jesus, I hissed. My heart was beating even faster, a frantic rhythm in the side of my throat. What was this? It seemed to be handwritten. Had Malfoy been writing it before he was a writer? I spun so abruptly that I nearly dropped the paper. One of my inspectors, whose name I couldn't quite recall, had arrived with an obscure-looking device under her arm, large and wooden and oblong, its face covered in unlabeled dials, which she set on the bedside table. A writer?" I repeated. "Have you heard of J. William Cross?" I shook my head. "Well, it's apparently his pen name. He's won loads of awards. I even read one of his novels, What Fills the Void That's Left Behind. Had no idea it was authored by a former Death Eater, although I suppose that's the idea of a pen name." She began to adjust the inscrutable dials on the face of her device. I watched her do it, feeling unbalanced. Malfoy wrote novels. It seemed so uncharacteristic of him. But then, how well had I really known him? We'd never been particularly close, or at least not in the ways that mattered. I wasn't in any sort of position to judge his creative capacity. "Which genres?" I asked without meaning to. "Horror, mostly." "Horror?" "Maybe that's not the right word for it. What Fills the Void wasn't really scary so much as it was, I don't know, unsettling. It keeps you up at night, but not from fear, from dread. It gets into your brain, you know, makes you really doubt yourself, wonder if you've ever lived up to the moral standards you think you believe in." I frowned, first at her and then at the bed. In a room like this, in a building like the Malfoy Manor, it was surprisingly easy to picture him bent over his desk, scribbling away into the small hours of the morning. It made me wish I'd kept up with him in the years after the end of the war. But after all the death and nightmares it had put me through, I felt like I had little choice but to become an Auror as soon as I could, or risked falling into my own void that was left behind. What was the saviour, after all, without anything to save? "Are there any ghosts I need to know about, Narcissa dear?" Trelawney asked when, after the last shreds of sunlight had faded behind the hillside, I came down to the parlour where the séance was set to begin. "Yes, 2. They don't tend to get in the way very much." "Our séance is going to draw their attention. It always does. Are they likely to take issue with my presence?" The parlour of the Malfoy Manor was as sumptuously decorated as the rest of the building, polished hardwood and thick pile rugs and rich velvet curtains, but it felt no less skin-crawling here than it did in the room with the blood-soaked bed. It was so cold, despite the fire roaring in the hearth, and the wind was absolutely bellowing against the walls. Perhaps a storm was coming in. "One may," Narcissa confessed with some reluctance. "Armand Malfoy III. He's been haunting this manor since the 14th century. He is, in fact, the reason the Malfoy family went back to France for a century." Trelawney nodded slowly. "Is he ornery?" "That's one word for it, I suppose. Let it suffice to say that he will know very quickly that both of you are half-blood, and he will give you no end of grief for it." Of course, the Malfoy Manor would be haunted by a racist ghost. I wasn't sure why I was surprised. I sat down slowly, once both Trelawney and Narcissa had situated themselves. The 2 heavy, overstuffed love seats had been pushed away from the centre of the room, making room for a conjured wooden table and 3 chairs. Trelawney had already set her crystal ball at the table's centre, and a handsome brass stand shaped like a bird's foot. "I see," Trelawney said. "And the other?" "She's harmless. Tragic, but harmless. Jean-Aloise Carré Malfoy, dead since the mid-1800s, if I recall correctly." "Very well." Trelawney drew an unsteady breath, as though bracing herself for something unpleasant. Outside, a pattering rain began drumming on the roof and windows. "Have either of you been to a séance before?" she eventually asked. "Not a true one," Narcissa answered, then glanced to me. I shook my head numbly. "Whatever preconceptions you have about them are best done away with," Trelawney began. "The gift of mediumship is a rare one, which has given way to all number of fraudsters and pretenders. They are all flesh and no substance. A true séance tends to be felt more than seen. They are visceral experiences and very dangerous." "But," Narcissa protested, "it's just Draco. He's no danger." "I will call for your son," Trelawney assured her, "but the veil between life and death is opaque. One may reach through, but can never be confident of what is drawn out." Crash from outside, a great clap of thunder that shook the building to its foundations. Narcissa jumped in her seat and craned her neck toward the nearest window. Water was sluicing down the aging glass, obscuring the dark view of the river outside even further. "Goodness," she whispered, voice tremulous. "What a storm. They do seem to come out of nowhere this time of year, don't they?" "Join hands," Trelawney said. Trelawney's hand was thin and clammy in mine, Narcissa's soft and cool. At once Trelawney's eyes fell shut, and she slumped forward slightly. "You both knew him in life," she said, without opening her eyes. "Focus on an image of him as best you can. Make it an honest picture. Anything less could be hazardous." I had vague recollections of séance being a subject we had brushed on in sixth-year divination, but of course I'd had a few other things going on that year which had dominated my attention. I trusted myself to do little more than follow the instructions of an expert in the field. So I shut my eyes, and I thought of him. Draco Malfoy. The first image of him that came to me was his 11-year-old self in Madame Malkin's. He'd made such an impression on me that day and hadn't even realized it. And yes, the impression was a bad one, but no one could say it wasn't an accurate picture at the time. I imagined him small and pointy and narrow, voice unbroken and gaze imperious. Imagine being in Hufflepuff. I think I'd leave, wouldn't you? Then the image shifted, grew. Malfoy, a year later, sneering at me from the other side of the Quidditch pitch. I never would have admitted it out loud at the time, but he was a damn good flyer, nearly as good as I was. "It's working," came Trelawney's terrified whisper. "The veil is parting. Keep focusing." Malfoy at 14, with his clever little bit of spell work on those awful little buttons he distributed. Potter stinks. He'd been such a little shit, but at least he'd never been boring. Malfoy at 16, crying in the bathroom. My chest constricted. I never got the chance to apologize, to tell him that I hadn't meant to hurt him so badly, to ask if that horrible wound had scarred over and hate myself accordingly. One more failure to add to the tally. The whole room shook. My eyes flew open. For a split second I thought it was another rumble of thunder, but no. The brass light fixture over our heads rattled on its chain, the portraits clattered against the walls. The crystal ball in the center of the table had turned an inky black. Behind Trelawney, a ghost, a woman veiled as if in mourning, shoulders shaking with emotion. Another was behind Narcissa, tall and imposing and sneering at me. "This will not end well," the lady ghost whispered. Jean-Eloise, I could only suppose. "It has not begun well," the other, I presumed Armand, remarked disdainfully. "There's something," Trelawney gasped. I looked over. Her eyes had rolled back in her head, and she had, I realized belatedly, tightened her grip on my hand to the point of pain. "There's something here, something huge, and... Sybil?" Narcissa asked, concerned. "Your ears?" I hadn't realized it till she'd pointed it out, but there it was. Blood running freely out from Trelawney's ears, down her throat and onto her shawl. She didn't even seem to notice.
"Mother?"
came a voice from Trelawney's mouth that did not belong to her. It was distorted somehow, almost tinny, but it was unmistakably Malfoy's.
"Mother, is that you? You can't be here. You have to go."
"Draco!" Narcissa cried, and stood up so abruptly that she knocked her chair over. Boom from outside, thunder 10 times louder, as though right above the manor's roof. "Draco, my darling, what happened?"
Go now."
Trelawney Malfoy said. The body was jerking, writhing almost as if in agony, and the voice strained and frayed.
"It's not safe here anymore."
"Sweetheart, where are you?" she begged.
I don't know. Beyond reach. Please, Mother, please just go. It's coming."
"What is?" I asked before I could stop myself. "Malfoy, what happened to you?" Trelawney shuddered, her head wrenched at an unnatural angle, sightless eyes pointed in my direction.
"Potter."
"I'm here to help," I said. "I'm here to get you out of wherever you are, if I can."
"Nothing can get me out. No one can help me."
Blood came pouring out from Trelawney's eyes, as though all the vessels under the sclera burst at the same time. I recoiled at the sight, nausea rolling heavily in my gut.
"I'm stranded in the dark."
Crash! A window shattered. Narcissa screamed and shards of glass came flying through the room. All at once, every light went out, every candle to the last flame, and even the roaring light of the fireplace with a crash of air.
"I'm stranded in the dark."
Wind was howling through the parlor, curtains flapping, papers flying. I tried to duck, but Trelawney's grip on my hand was so tight that I could feel the bones of my hand bending so severely that I was sure they'd snap.
"It's coming!"
Lightning flashed, filled the room. The wind screamed, more windows exploded, a dreadful and deafening cacophony that I could feel physically blasting through my skull. Narcissa bent forward with a shriek over the trembling table, folding her arms over her head, and then, as abruptly as it began, it ended. The silence rang in my ears, and my vision swam in and out of focus. Narcissa, beside me, slowly lifted her head, revealing a gash on one cheek, dark blood running down to her jaw. Trelawney, though, was on the floor. "You'll tell me, won't you, if you get any news of her recovery before I do?" "I will. Are you sure you don't want to go to St. Mungo's yourself? That cut looks deep." Narcissa waved one hand airily, but her eyes, red from terrified tears, betrayed her ostensible composure. "I'm fine," she said, and I wasn't sure I believed her. How could she possibly be fine after hearing her own son scream about being stranded in darkness? But I also wasn't willing to push it. The fireplace rushed in the sitting room, and we both looked through the archway toward it. From our vantage in the entryway, we could see a healer in white robes hovering Trelawney, magically secured to a floating stretcher, through the green flames. Guilt twisted in my throat. If I'd known a séance would be this dangerous, I'd have sought alternatives. "Narcissa," I said, turning back toward her, "the initial Auror to take this case theorized that your son might have been affected by... what did he call it? Domino Deverato," she answered at once. Her voice was thin and shaking almost imperceptibly. "Yes, I recall. An extraordinarily rare magical phenomenon." "Has it ever happened in the Malfoy Manor before?" I asked. "There have only been a dozen documented cases since the Roman conquest of Britain, and I should know. I looked into it. It's a process that rarely leaves anything behind. The master is wholly consumed, as the name suggests." I knew little of Latin, but I knew enough to determine the root of the word deverato. Devour. That's not to suggest I think the manor is unrelated to whatever happened to him, she continued, the trembling in her voice becoming more and more pronounced, because I think it very likely that it was. Buildings like these absorb as much magic as they create. They feed on the power of their inhabitants and give it back to them in ways that aren't easy to predict. And the manor specifically has experienced some darkness in the not-too-recent past. Evil deaths, I said without meaning to, and turned my eyes in time to see the last whisper of the healer's robe vanish through the flue. They leave jagged holes in the veil. That's what they say. There was something in the corner of my eye. Sybil will be able to give you more information, I suspect. A figure, tall and dark, crowned in gold, and run through with scarlet. In spite of everything, I find it difficult to leave. I spun toward it, and it was gone. An empty corner, an angle of shadow. My heart thudded in my neck. Was that... What did I just... Harry? Yes. I swallowed, sucked a few hard breaths down. Yes, Sorry. I don't think staying here is a good idea. My son is still here, she protested, or at least a part of him. And I understand the impulse to be near him in the only way you can after everything, I answered, but you came to me at least in part because of my expertise with dark magic. Narcissa, this place reeks of it. It is not safe. Dark magic is at its most volatile when it's ambient. Without a channel or a structure, it adapts to the fear and anger and guilt and despair of those around it, amplifies it. Is that... Narcissa's face contorted in agony, despite her best efforts to conceal it. Is that what happened to Draco? Staying so long in this place like he did, all alone, did it amplify his grief? Is that why he... It's too early to speculate, I said. Go back to France. I'll contact you as soon as I learn anything, and I swear, Narcissa, I will find the answers you are due, one way or another. It is the very least I owe you, and your son. She nodded. Then she gripped my wrist tightly, as if she did not trust her own voice to offer goodbyes, and went through to the sitting room to flew out. I watched as her blonde hair and black robes vanished through the fire. The inspectors had long since left as well, before the storm had hit. I was alone. My ears rang as if to fill the sudden silence. There was something in the corner of my eye again. It was at the bottom of the stairs, just to my left this time. Gold, black, scarlet. I could hear it breathing, shuddering. I did not want to look, but could not stop myself from turning, slowly, carefully. Long limbs, pale hair, blood all down his front, dripping from his fingertips. Ringing, ringing, ringing in my ears. I stared, horrified, at the flickering, shuddering, sobbing image of Draco Malfoy. He opened his mouth to scream. All that came out was more blood, gushing like a wound. Wider and wider his mouth splayed, jaw unhinging, and the blood spread further at his feet, and I stumbled and I scrambled backward and hit the wall, and then... Gone. Gone, like he'd never been there at all. My chest heaved. My legs gave out. I slid down the wall, hit the floor. All my knowledge, all my expertise felt insubstantial, like loose sand giving way under my feet. I sat and I shook and felt my own warning made manifest. Guilt, pulsing like a heartbeat in the most vulnerable part of my soul. An old pain ripped open all over again. Though perhaps it had never closed in the first place. They say I will be released tomorrow, Trelawney said. Her voice was thready, almost frenetic. In the overlit hospital room, her skin looked sallow, tinged slightly yellow, but she smiled, like she was afraid of what might happen if she let the darkness in. I am feeling much better. They healed the burst eardrums quickly. They don't even hurt anymore. God, burst eardrums. I am so sorry, I said. Professor, I am so indescribably sorry. If I'd known you'd be putting yourself at this kind of risk. No, please don't apologize. I won't say I was happy to help, but I knew what I was getting into. For what it's worth, I consider your contract fulfilled, and the DMLE will cover, of course, all expenses related to your hospital stay and compensate you for any leave from your job that you might require, on top of the usual consultation fee. That's very generous, but not necessary. But I didn't want to ask. She'd been through so much already, but I had made Narcissa Malfoy a promise. Carefully, I sat down at the chair pulled up at her bedside. I confess I'm not entirely sure what it is I saw, I told her. You seemed to channel Draco Malfoy's spirit. Does that mean he's dead? For sure? She stared hard at me, thin hands wringing in the flimsy paper of her hospital gown. It took her a long time to answer. For sure? No, I cannot say anything for sure. There was nothing normal about that séance. I have seen terrifying apparitions and heard horrible howling voices from the beyond, but to call down a storm like that? To blow out every window in the room? That was something else entirely. Power and darkness like I've never seen before. And his presence was confounding. Spirits are never summoned so easily. He could not speak till the veil had parted, yet could not pass through. He is tangled, I think, snarled in the magical division between life and death. How he came to be this way, I do not know, nor do I wish to. But I got a taste, just a taste, of the horror he was trapped in when we summoned him. The veil is not the only thing that binds him. There is a darkness in every corner of that wretched, hollowed house, beating like a terrible black heart. I've never seen its like before. It is consuming him, digesting him. A nightmare made into a prison of the worst kind, the kind that convinces you it is what you deserve. And I can offer you no advice. This case is singular, and all my skill in mediumship falls woefully short. I cannot learn more without speaking to him, and I cannot speak to him without risking another séance, which is clearly much too dangerous. It would take skill far beyond my own to learn more, an ability to walk between life and death that I do not possess, that I am not sure even exists. My dear, you must be cautious. However you proceed, the darkness in that house hungers yet, and I do not expect it will be discerning in its meals.